So I'm going to tell you about current clinical research in vasculitis. It's kind of an overview. Carol already told you about some of the ongoing studies, so I'm not going to repeat that in any detail. I'm going to give you an overview of where things are at in the world, not just with the work that we do, although that's a lot of it that has helped organize things internationally. So that's me. I should tell you that as we talk about these things, it's important to know that we get funding from all over. We get funding from good drug companies. They give us drug. They give us money to actually help conduct studies. We try to maintain an independence from that. But you should know that we do actually conduct research. Many of us here together, some of these projects are partially sponsored by companies, and that's because they want to often help advance the science, but also, of course, promote the product and see if it works in vasculitis. However, without that kind of support, let me tell you, it's hard to do a study. The RAVE study, for example, that helped get rituximab funded, labeled by the FDA and allowed to use, was about a $9 million study. That doesn't include the cost of this drug. That doesn't include all the extra time that was put into it by a lot of other people. So not to mention the $50 billion it took to develop the drug. So these are very expensive studies to move forward in. Much of the research, I'll tell you, is actually funded by you through your tax dollars, through the FDA, the NIH, and PCORI and other aspects to it, as well as the Vasculitis Foundation. I'll try to point out along the way, and I think Gary's talk will specifically point out the research being done by the VF, so I won't go into any detail. But there's, as he said, a lot of pilot and important work. And you'll see that often things are funded by a variety of ways, and that's important. I'll say what I think you've already heard. There has never been more research going on in vasculitis in the world than right now. It is amazing the amount of work being done in vasculitis. And it's not as if we just grew a whole lot more patients with vasculitis. There are more centers, there are more people involved, there are more patients involved, there's more interest. We've gotten companies interested, governments interested, and I think the success of the work that's been done in the last 20 years, built upon some of the work that Gary did and others, the elders, really made it possible for us to get to this point. So what kind of research is there out there? So what types of clinical research studies? We keep throwing all these different things at you, and I'm just going to talk about clinical research where we actually touch patients. So there's registries, or don't touch patients, registries. Again, we've talked about the registry. There are different registries, and it allows us to do research in a different way online and conduct things. We're actually trying to raise the sophistication of that by trying to figure out how to actually have data uploaded from your own computer. But that's one type of research. There's survey and epidemiologic studies. So registries are nice. They can tell you about a population, but we want to do something with them. Surveys, epidemiologic work using large databases of everybody who's in Sweden who has vasculitis, we do work there, etc., because they follow people from birth till death, medical records, etc. We use large databases in the United Kingdom and the United States, etc. So epidemiologic studies, survey studies, many of you have participated. How many people here have, and you can raise your hand if you're with someone who does it also, so we get a sense of it. How many people here have been part of a research study of any sort? All right, well that's excellent. That is excellent. And it tells you not that you have to, but it's nice to be part. How many people here thought it was a good experience? All right, excellent. And I think it is. Observational studies. So we're going to tell you about, we follow patients over time, collect blood, collect information. We have actually conducted a number of these very large observational studies, and they've been extremely productive and helpful. Now, again, they answer some questions, but they don't answer other questions. So you need different studies to answer different questions. Following people over time is very good for understanding disease, understanding certain ways of measuring disease, but may not tell you about drug A versus drug B. It may give you a hint, but it's not as definitive. We get a lot of biologic specimens. We like to collect blood because we get very thirsty, and it's really, we get blood, we get urine, there's not a lot of parts of your body we won't probe and get specimens out of. Just you wait for the microbiome study that Dr. Grayson wants to do. And so we just go lots of places, nose, etc. And we use those specimens. We consider those specimens precious, and we're very careful about how we use them. But we collect a lot. And you need to do a lot because you never know which batch is going to be important. We evaluate new diagnostic tools. How do you study a disease that hasn't been studied before? So it's not good enough to just say, oh, I feel better. Or, oh, she looks good. That's nice, but that's not going to get a drug approved for market, and it's not really what you want to know. You don't want to know, Dr. Merkel, should I take, drug X? I said, well, we saw a couple of patients, they seem to do okay. That's not a good enough answer. We need better therapy. So we want to figure out how to evaluate the patient. So that's another type of study. And then we do, and all of these are linked to sort of the translational studies we talked about, that Dr. Grayson talked about the biologic specimens and all of these other cool studies that we're doing. But then there's the therapeutic clinical trials. So this is sort of the catalog studies. Everybody this gets the big press, but they're not in isolation. So we do these randomized trials. We did the RAVE study. We took 197 patients. It took us years to do. But we took a lot of blood and specimens, and now we're studying those, as Peter talked about. But we also do the trials in order to get an answer. And so therapeutic trials are there to give us an answer. Does this drug work? Does it help patients? Does it make them feel better? Does it help them feel better more safely? Does it better than the drugs we have? Now, we can do that in a variety of ways. We can do it with what we call open label studies. So Dr. Langford told you about our open label study that she led on abatacept, which is we took a bunch of patients, we studied them, and we learned a lot from that. We said, this is safe to use. We're getting results we think are very positive, and that's leading to a much larger study that she's leading within the VCRC as well, which I'll tell you briefly about. We do randomized studies. This is the definitive study. You take a bunch of patients, and one you give drug A, and one you either give drug B or you don't give the drug, and you compare the two. And that's the best way to really find out if it works. You don't know what you're on. We don't know what you're on. It's the best way to do it because you really scientifically it's the strongest. But you can't always do that with these rare diseases, and you can't always do that because the number one thing we have to do is make sure we're doing it safely and that we're not compromising people's care. We do single-arm studies. We do multi-arm studies, meaning one drug, two drugs, three drugs, compare. We do drugs versus other treatments, not always drug treatment. And we do single versus multi-center studies. So one of the things we're really getting away from is fewer and fewer where just one hospital tries to do it. Because, one hospital can do it and it takes 8 years and they don't get a definitive answer. But if you get 8 or 20 or 50 centers together, you can get a better study done faster and more definitively. And that's really what we're doing much more of. So, how do we organize clinical research? We do single center studies, I tell you that. There's still a role for that. You can still even do therapeutic trials in a single center, but it's hard. It's often to get pilot data. But our single center study that Monica Grayson and I did in terms of the nasal expression study, that's a single center study. We may expand that into multi-center now to get more information. So those kind of studies can be very good single center. You may get a new experience for how to use a drug-eluting stent. I know it's being done at Cleveland Clinic or other things like that. We're doing some single center studies at Penn, but it's a mix-up. Mix different things. Multi-center studies are really the way the field has gone in terms of therapeutic trials. And I'm going to tell you about multi-center studies that involve the networks, and the big networks include the Vasculitis Clinical Research Consortium, which I have the privilege of leading, the European Vasculitis Study Group, and there's the French Vasculitis Study Group, which works with us. And actually, all three of these groups work together. And actually, several of our studies now, the VCRC and the EUVAS, it's one study. And I'll tell you that. We've just said, even if the United Nations can't together, we're going to get together and we're going to study, and we have international studies and we share credit, we share the things, and it works very, very well. There are also other kinds of multi-center studies sponsored by a company, for example, that don't necessarily go through our networks, and then there's these hybrids where we do both together. How do we fund these studies? Well, we get investigator-initiated grants, which means I'll sit and I'll write a grant with many others, and we write a grant, we apply to the NIH, and hopefully we're lucky enough to get funding, and that sponsors it. Or we get funded by private foundations, such as the Vasculitis Foundation, which can either do enough for a particular study or enough to pilot us to keep us moving and in the right direction. That's been incredibly important. So that's individual grants from government or private foundations. Industry sponsors research as well, especially therapeutic trials, and we're very much interested in partnering with industry. And one of the things I can tell you is that although we get a fair amount of money from the National Institutes of Health and foundations, they're increasingly open to let us work with industry together. So it's sort of a partnership. We might get drug from industry, so we're doing a trial the abatacept study. We got drug from the company, we got money from the NIH through the VCRC, and we were able to do the study. Our next study is going to involve money from the company, using some resource from the NIH, and drug. So it's all a combination, and it works well. And that's all evolved in the last 10 years, I think. It has to be done that. So let's talk about, I already told you a little about single center studies. They can be very effective. I actually already talked about all of this. So I'm going to go on to some examples. So what are the major trials being done in the world? Let's go by disease. For GPA and MPA, there is a trial in Europe called the REMAIN study. That's over, actually. We're waiting to see that. That's if long-term azathioprine for remission maintenance versus placebo, which, how effective is it? We're waiting for those data to be published. They also did a trial in Europe, the EUVAS study of mycophenolate or Cellcept or Myfortic, different names for the same drug, versus cyclophosphamide for induction. We've seen those data. They haven't been published. Complicated, somewhat mixed up results. Difficult to interpret till we see it in the end. But that's going to come out soon, and that will be interesting as well. And then we have I'll skip to the main Ritson study, which Dr. Langford referred to, rituximab for remission maintenance. The French vasculitis study group done interesting data. I think gives us a partial answer, but not a full answer, which is why we're also doing the rituximab study, which I won't go into detail, although I'm leading that with Dr. Jane from the European Vasculitis Study group, and many of the investigators you've heard are all part of this study. This is a study that just started. We enrolled our first patient 2 weeks ago in North America, and there's a patient that's also been enrolled in Cambridge, UK, and we're beginning to open up all the other centers. This is rituximab. As we talked about, we don't know what to do after we give rituximab. Do we keep retreating? We have some ideas, but we want to know. Everybody gets rituximab if they flare, and then half the patients get ongoing rituximab for 2 years, and half the patient gets azathioprine. And we're trying to see, are they equivalent? Is one better than the other? What about the safety? What about giving 2 years of these drugs? I can tell you there's a cost difference. I can tell you that it's different between getting an IV every few months and taking a pill every day. So we're trying to see, this is an important study to figure out what's going on. The PEXAVAS study is the largest vasculitis study in the world that's ever been done, and we already have 260-something patients. We're going for 500 patients in 40 countries and centers. This is another study that I'm leading with 2 other colleagues, and this is a very international study of plasma exchange, plasmapheresis. Take your blood out and take out the antibodies and put your blood back in. Complicated study for pretty sick patients. We're doing it in hospitals, and we're going to have an answer in several years from this. It's going to answer a big question of whether we should be doing plasmapheresis or not, and who should we do it in. Largest study I've done. The BREVIS study is a study sponsored by a different company, another company. This is looking at a drug called belimumab, which I won't get into, but it affects the activity of B cells. It's looking at whether or not that can maintain people in remission as well. So this is a study completely sponsored by a company. So rituximab is, we have money from the company, from Roche and Genentech, plus the NIH, plus other countries to do it. Hybrid, the BREVIS study, fully funded by the company in various centers to see if this drug can help keep people in remission. The TAPER study, it's coming to a newsletter near you in the next few months. This is a study of prednisone tapering, whether you should maintain on a low dose of prednisone versus maintaining on 0. So the big question is, should you stay on 5 versus 0? Doesn't sound like a big question unless it's you, in which case this is a question we ask every day. Is low dose good or bad? And we're going to try to test it out in some interesting ways you can join online versus going to a center. So it's kind of a cool study to figure out what's going on. And we're going to start that. So that's the TAPER study, standing for taper, as in tapering the dose. This is actually what is that? A trial. I should know this. I'm the lead investigator for this trial. And so prednisone in remission is tapering an assessment of prednisone in remission. We also named it after, there's this cute little taper animal. And so that's our little logo. And it's an endangered species, so it's a rare animal. So I get it, rare, taper. And so abrogate, you gotta have abrogate, which means to eliminate, is a great acronym. I can't take credit for abrogate. That is Dr. Langford's acronym. So abrogate is a study that she is leading for the Vasculitis Clinical Research Consortium. It hasn't started yet. It's happening first quarter next year, let's say, first patient in, maybe third quarter this year, we'll see. It takes a long time to start studies. This is a large, multi-center international study that's going to look at abatacept for mild to moderate GPA. So many patients, just they need 10, 15, 20 milligrams of prednisone. Very annoying, keep having problems. We're going to try to see if for those people, we don't want to give super big guns, can we get those people off prednisone? So that's an important area that we haven't studied as well, and that's a follow-up to the pilot study. So there's an example of a small pilot study leading to a multi-million-dollar, large phase 3 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial in multiple countries. So this pilot stuff can work. And then there are other studies that are ongoing, but they're not necessarily multi-center as much. What about other disease? Oh, EGPA. So I won't go on because Dr. Langford already told you that there's studies in mepolizumab for EGPA or Church-Strauss. This is a new study that's happening. This will be an important randomized multi-center study for Church-Strauss. What about large vessel vasculitis? Well, we heard a little bit about the abatacept study that Dr. Langford is leading for the VCRC as well. This is a study of abatacept for GCA and Takayasu's. This is the first trial in the history of this world on Takayasu's arteritis, first randomized trial. So we are determined to complete this trial because we really need to get an answer. We're also doing it for giant cell arteritis, and we're closer to completing that as well. And there's a big study starting called the GIACTA study, looking at tocilizumab, as she mentioned that as well, for giant cell arteritis. It's important to do these studies. You notice there aren't as many because it's a little harder to do in certain diseases than others. There are ongoing studies in Behçet's disease, Apremilast, and other drugs, especially going on in other parts of the world where the disease is more common, but there are multi-center studies going on there as well. There is all different forms of vasculitis are being studied in a study called DCVAS, which I actually lead with Rashid Lukmani and Richard Watts. This is a study directly funded by the Vasculitis Foundation and also sponsored by the American College of Rheumatology and the European League Against Rheumatism. This is looking, we're not so good. We like to think we're really good about diagnosing and classifying people. You have this disease, you have that disease. Not always that simple. And we want better criteria. So we're taking data. Many of you have probably been part of it. If you've been to one of our centers in the last few years, we take your data, we put it into a computer, we're trying to figure out how best to sort out the diseases and how best to diagnose them. And so we're using those data. And lots of people, we have over 1,000 patients that have participated in about 30 countries, and it keeps growing. So that's an important big study as well. Not a therapeutic trial, but another study. So let me tell you a little about how the network's organized. I'll tell you about we keep talking about the Vasculitis Clinical Research Consortium. Let me tell you about that. We're part of the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network. So what is the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network, or the RDCRN? It was established 10 years ago by the NIH Office of Rare Diseases Research. It was through an act of Congress, through lobbying from patients with rare diseases saying we need more rare disease research because there are almost 7,000 rare diseases. And so most families are affected one way or the other by a rare disease, but they're hard to study. Currently involves multiple institutions and diseases and many patients throughout the world. The goal of the network is to create consortia, individual smaller networks that study rare diseases. We try to share costs by having central administrative costs, central data control, sort of saving money by doing central approaches, common approaches, and uniform data collection approaches. We want to do large-scale studies that are doable, and we directly want to engage patients, and we've been very successful in directly engaging patients. We have the Vasculitis Foundation is directly involved. They come to our meetings. We're very much involved. You keep getting, it's a partnership with the VF as you get our newsletters, etc., not just for recruitment, but for feedback about what makes sense. We get feedback and say, those forms are really stupid. And so we change them and we make something different. So we have had good feedback. Oh no, don't do that because nobody's ever going to join that study. We get scientific feedback as well. Very much involved with the patients. And we train new investigators. Dr. Grayson was one of our fellows, etc. And some of our fellows have gone on to form new vasculitis centers elsewhere, and that's been very gratifying as well. So the VCRC is was a network of networks, and everybody's got really cool little signs and logos, and you think you don't want vasculitis, you really don't want some of these diseases. So these are some really weird, rare diseases, some neurologic ones, some cancer diseases, kidney diseases, etc. And we all study weird, rare diseases and try to work together to make it work better. So what the VCRC, we've been a founding member of this, of the RDCRN. We've had several grants, and then we get a lot more grants to help keep it moving. I've had a chance to coordinate it, first at Boston and now at Penn. And I think it's safe to say we are the major infrastructure and driver of clinical research in vasculitis in North America, and one, along with EUVAS, the two major centers programs that really drive things internationally. We're not exclusive, but we do a lot of stuff, and it's because we have a lot of wonderful people that work together. So where are we in the United States? You've seen this map. Oh, this is a much better version. I don't know what the hell you did with my picture there, Grayson, but you killed it. You're mixing up Wisconsin and Minnesota. It's they're not going to let you in the Midwest. They're just not going to let you go there. So these were our original centers, and then we've expanded to more centers in Canada and elsewhere. Utah, we opened that because Curry Koenig, VCRC fellow Cleveland, moves to Utah, opens up a center. I moved to Penn, so then we get to move that, and it gets a star. And then we have Sharon Chung over at UCSF. We have Mike Weissman at Cedars-Sinai, University of North Carolina. All these places are now seeing patients, doing part of our trials, and doing it more. We're expanding further to other sites, and we do a huge amount of work with the European sites as well. I just didn't put them on the map. And we have a major center in Florida that helps coordinate things. We've got additional studies, additional places that are coming who don't seem to get their little round dots. We have patient advocacy groups, but especially the VF, but also the Church-Strauss Syndrome Association and the PA Support Group and others, all of whom work together to help us make this happen. We have labs, this is even all over the world, that are taking our specimens and doing things. So it's a huge sort of operation that we keep growing, not huge, but it's pretty big for us to keep things moving. So it's a very international collaborative group. Here's the studies that we're doing, and I'll go through these fairly quickly. We do clinical cohorts, we do outcome studies, we do therapeutic trials, and we do a contact registry. We have hundreds and up to over thousands of patients involved in our trials. And so that has been very steadily increasing. So we have hundreds of patients involved in our longitudinal studies. Some of our studies are small and the numbers are small, and some of them are much bigger that we've been able to do. So that we've been very effective in recruiting patients, and many of you are involved, and some of you are involved in more than one of our studies. The longitudinal studies were pointed out. I'll go quickly. These are patients come into our centers. We draw lots of blood. We take urine. We do lots of clinical information. You fill out forms every 3 months or once a year, depending on how you're doing and where you live and what's going on. With those specimens, we've been able to do, and all that clinical data, all goes into a computer. It's all linked. So your little tube of serum or DNA is linked to your visit and who you are, etc. Although when the data goes outside, nobody knows who you are. We keep it, your privacy is intact. What have we been able to do with that? We've multiple studies and papers and descriptions of expanding our understanding of the actual disease. And it's not just one disease. We have published on GPA and MPA and Takayasu's and GCA and PAN and EGPA Church-Strauss. And we are really being able to use these data because these are expert centers. Everyone's really being able to do a lot of details, and we have lots of patients involved. And I'm particularly happy to know that we have some young trainees and now junior faculty who've been involved in leading these studies to the next generation as well. He mentioned the biomarker studies. The slide looks alike because I sent him the slide. He stole my slides. And so we have lots of different studies that are being done in blood and in serum and plasma all over the world. Some very small, very detailed studies, and some larger studies that are being done. Very exciting work as we try to develop it. Dr. Monix helped lead the program in biomarker development. Again, his knowledge of having a PhD in immunology as well as being an MD really helps lead in that. We're doing a lot of genetic studies. We have the largest repository of genetic material at this point in the world for patients with vasculitis, and it keeps growing. And we are doing a lot of study. Triple genetic studies, very expensive to do, but we've been able to partner, and we're going to be doing a very large genetic study in GPA and MPA, and then we're going to combine it with the European group, and then we're going to reanalyze it together. So again, it's the world working together. This is how it has to work. We're contributing samples to other people's collections in eGPA, for example. That's ongoing. In Takayasu's, we have publication coming out looking at the genetics, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of stuff going on. We have new investigators like Dr. Chung, who's going to take it to the next level, and Dr. Grayson in gene expression, epigenetics, et cetera. So we like to use these data carefully, and it's because we actually study the patients and not just their blood. You're much more than just a bunch of DNA, and so we have to study it carefully. Outcome studies. So this is how you measure disease, how you figure out what's happening, going on. So we're doing a study, ongoing study of MRI and PET and Takayasu's, but also what I want to particularly point out is that we're doing studies with patients directly, not just on you, but with you. So I want to just mention that we have a partnership. So our speaker the other night on the opening ceremony talked to us about the PCORI. This is the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute. It's funded by the United States government, but it's separate from the NIH. We have a grant. We got one of the first wave of grants. This is a very patient-centered approach, partnering with the VF and the VCRC. We are asking patients about their disease, and what we're doing is it's a partnership between physician investigators, patients, and other researchers. We have patients on our steering committee. We have patients actually known to you, patients from the US and from the UK. You may know Dr. Don Gephardt, who was a former board member of the VF, and is not here at this meeting, but he's one of the partners as a patient, actually, and others involved directly in the room, directly on the calls. They are the investigators, and we're asking patients, we're interviewing patients throughout the world about their experience. Tell us what it means to have this disease. Give us some adjectives. We're tape recording, we're transcribing it. It's a whole science of asking patients so we can develop an outcome. Here's a shocker. Patients think about their disease differently from physicians. And you have different ideas of what's important and what's not important. And it's not that we're wrong and you're right, or you're wrong and that we're right. It's all important. So yeah, kidney disease, we think it's pretty important. But you know what? Not being able to breathe through your nose, not being able to, being tired all the time, also very important. So patients are experts in their disease, just like we're experts in the disease in a different way. And so we're directly partnering with patients to help us develop ways of measuring the disease. So we're going to use the patients to help us decide, how do you measure disease? Well, is it going to replace the creatinine and replace other things? No, it's going to work together. And so we'll be able to say, so you filled out these forms where they ask you how you feel, but you're like, that's not relevant to what I'm doing. That's not my disease. And so we're trying to figure it out. So we're directly working with patients, and that's been really good. And so that's a new wave of work that we're doing. We have the registry, the Vasculitis Clinical Research Consortium Contact Registry. I think we've certainly browbeated you about that, getting involved. Anonymous registry, then you give us data. We're expanding this greatly. We're doing research on it. You can get it through our website. You have the forms to fill out. Hopefully you get our newsletters. It's been very successful. We have almost 4,000 patients with various diseases. We've tried to break into some new diseases, and we need your help to generate more information from those diseases. But we have a lot of patients involved, and what we're doing is we've done this reproductive health study and trying to get a better sense of that. That's being published soon. It's actually available online now. It will be published soon. We're going to do a pregnancy registry, an online registry, to first ever to people, women who are pregnant will register and will get a sense of how do the women do during the pregnancy, and how do the babies do? And we just desperately need more information, and we're going to try to do that internationally. Very hard to do, but with central resources we can do it online. We did an illness perception study, which Dr. Grayson talked about in one of his things, where we asked about fatigue and other issues. We are publishing those, very helpful, patients directly participating. We have educational needs study we did with people in the United Kingdom, get a sense of what do patients want, what do they need. We're publishing that as well. And then we're going to confirm the diagnoses online so we can do even more. So lots of things going on. What about the therapeutic trials? I sort of looked over those. Those are our pilot. We have the pilot study that we've heard about. We have the EUVAS study I told you about as well. We're sponsoring the FVSG study, the Retaziram study, TAPER study, and the Abrogate study. So we started with nothing 10 years ago, and we have multiple clinical trials, multiple other registry studies, really a lot going on. We almost want to have a menu so that if patients come in, there's something that they can participate in. So, whoa, what happened? What did I do? Okay. The Europeans are also very involved. I should tell you they're involved in lots of studies. They've done some wonderful studies that have helped standard of care. The current studies, I told you about these already, so I won't go over that. They're partnering with FVSG and Retaziram. They'll be partnering with Abrogate, although we're running it here. We're running these last few from here. And they also have samples that they collect. I'm not blowing that off, but just that, again, we're partnering with them very closely. I won't get into this is the FVSG or the other one. French Vasculitis Study Group have done a lot of their own studies as well, and we heard about Ben Ritson, and they're going to do a follow-up as well. So we try to all work together and figure it out. We have people from France involved in our studies as well. But I don't want to leave them out. They're doing some very important work as well. So there, you may say, well, why isn't my form of vasculitis being studied? Well, first of all, I've hoped to convince you that we're studying a lot of different forms of vasculitis. And if you've learned anything from the last several days, hopefully it also includes that clues we get from one form of vasculitis are important for another form of vasculitis. And what we learn from one may help another. And so many of these types of vasculitis are being studied one way or the other, and are being studied somewhere in the world. Not all of them all the time. It's difficult to do. So CNS vasculitis, difficult disease to study. It's rare. It's hard to find enough. But we're actually collecting some data in some centers to try to advance that as well. So you'd be surprised. And then what we learn from one can really help. There is, as I said, there's more research being conducted in vasculitis than ever before. So why should someone participate? Well, it doesn't look like I have to convince too many of you. And I think you shouldn't feel you have to. It's very important to remember that physicians better not make a difference to you whether you're in studies or not. We love you anyway. We will take care of you anyway. You should join a study because you want to. Why should you join a study? You should join a study because rare diseases are hard to study without dedicated volunteer subjects. It doesn't happen without you. Because participation in research studies is empowering. It makes you feel like you're part of your disease. You're part of advancing what we're doing. If not you, then others can be helped down the line. It's interesting. It's fun to see us run around like crazy people trying to get you to do these things. No, it's interesting to see what are we asking, what questions are we asking, what's going on. It's different on that side to see how much it takes to do these studies. And it may help others in the future. That's the most important reason perhaps to take it. And because it's going to advance our understanding of the pathophysiology, what goes on in disease, and how do we best treat. And because only through properly done studies can good science be advanced. That's the reasons to do it, not for these reasons. Don't do it because you want to get rich. So not a good idea. It ain't going to happen anyway. And we may sometimes give you money to pay for parking, but these days it barely pays for parking at some of our centers. And it doesn't pay for the toll across the bridge. Don't do it because someone else told you you should do it. I would say it's a good idea to get advice and people that you love and trust to give you some guidance on this. And if your partner says, this is a really bad idea, you might, depending on your relationship, listen or not. But don't do it because someone else tells you. In the end, it's your decision. Is this the right thing for you? Don't do it because your doctor told you to do it. First of all, if he or she told you they shouldn't be doing research, they may have advised this is something you might want to consider. We will treat you anyway. Don't do it to please your doctor. People like to please their doctors. It's nice. We appreciate that you don't want to completely, annoy us, but we don't do that. Don't do it because we ask. We have a vested interest. Know that we want you to be part of studies, but if it's right for you, okay? Don't do it, as I said, to please your doctor because you think you're going to disappoint it. And don't do it because you think you're going to get the cure. These are experiments, okay? They're experiments. If we knew the answer, we wouldn't be doing the study. So recognize that they're experiments at some level. Not all the studies have risk. Some of them are just collecting data, but understand that they're experiments, and you should participate if it's the right thing for you. But we hope you consider them. Where can you find reliable information about it? I'll finish up with this about clinical trials. You can find it right at home at the Vasculitis Foundation website. You just do the drop down for research, and you can go and it will tell you all about different studies that are going on. And this is just an example, and we're going to hear about some of that stuff. You can go to the VCRC website, where we'll tell you exactly what studies that we're doing. You can click, and you can list all of our studies that are ongoing. Here's one, for example, and you can figure out what's right for you, if it's something that works for you. We also have information about what a clinical trial is, how to go. And you can go to your government. I'm here from the government. We're here to help. The clinicaltrials.gov, it's not just the United States. This is international. And you go to www.clinicaltrials.gov, and up in that upper right there, you put in your disease name, and it's going to list all these different studies that are ongoing. And most of the studies are registered for that. And it's a very useful place to get. There's not a lot of details per se, but it gives you some idea. I'm not going to talk about VF-sponsored research because Dr. Hoffman's going to talk about that, but I will mention that it is, very, very important. I'm going to end by just letting you know that we have, I represent a very large group of investigators that have dedicated both in this country, in Canada, and in Europe, and in multiple countries. I have the privilege of working with many different people Many different people lead on different aspects of the study. Some of us have to do some organization, but it doesn't happen without a very large group of people. And it doesn't happen without a lot of different funding agencies. And you'll notice most of these are government-sponsored agencies on top, that in our government or other governments, as well as industry sponsors that have been very important in moving forward. So we do what it takes, within reason, to get this work done, and that's been very helpful. So I will end with that, and I think I'll take questions after we have the time with Dr. Hoffman. But wait, thank you, that's the end.